It is the night of 29th December, 1940, and the Luftwaffe is once again turning the sky above Britain into a theatre of fire. From 30,000 feet, the German Pathfinder crews peer down through their Heinkel cockpit glass at the coast of southern England, hunting for the glittering thread of the Thames, searching for the dark mass of the island below. London burns. It has been burning for months, and yet, on this particular night, something extraordinary is about to happen. Not over the capital, but many miles away, in the open countryside of Wiltshire and Dorset and the Somerset levels. In fields that should be utterly dark, fire suddenly erupts. Enormous, roaring, confident columns of flame rise from the earth, painting the underside of the clouds in shades of amber and crimson. The pilots of the second wave, following their Pathfinder's radio beacons, look down and see what appears to be a city already burning, already struck, already broken. They release their bombs. Thousands of kilograms of high explosives and incendiaries tumble into the darkness and detonate across empty farmland. Cows scatter, hedgerows splinter, craters open in fields that have never seen so much as a lorry. And in London, in Bristol, in Coventry, in Birmingham, the real targets, the people who would have died that night, do not die. This is the story of one of the most audacious and least celebrated deception operations in the history of modern warfare. This is the story of the British Starfish sites, a network of carefully engineered decoy fires, fake cities constructed from timber and paraffin and ingenuity that convinced some of the most technically sophisticated bomber crews in the world to destroy nothing of consequence, night after night after night. It is a story of scientists working in requisitioned country houses, of engineers driving unmarked lorries across blacked-out England, of a weapon so simple in conception and so precise in execution that it defies easy categorization. It was not a gun, it was not a bomb, it was a lie, and it may have saved tens of thousands of lives. To understand why the Starfish sites existed at all, you must first understand the particular horror of the Blitz as it unfolded in the winter of 1940. The German bombing campaign against Britain was not random. It was guided, or rather, it was intended to be guided, by a sophisticated system of intersecting radio beams developed by the Luftwaffe's Signals Division. The system, known as Knickerbein, German for crooked leg, projected two beams across the North Sea and over Britain. Where the beams crossed, the bombs fell. It was elegant. It was, by the standards of the day, remarkably accurate. And it was giving the Luftwaffe an ability that no air force had previously possessed: the ability to hit specific targets in the dark. Britain's scientific community had, by late 1940, begun to understand this system and to develop countermeasures. Dr. R.Y. Jones, a brilliant young physicist working in air intelligence, had pieced together the truth about the beams from captured documents and signals intercepts, and teams of RAF aircraft were already flying circuits over England, bent their own transmitters to bend and distort the German signals, pushing bombers off course. This was the work of what became known as the Battle of the Beams, a largely invisible war fought in the electromagnetic spectrum. But bending a beam took time, required precise equipment, and did not always work. The Germans adapted, they improved their systems, and British cities continued to burn. The fundamental problem was this: even a partially deflected bomber, even a crew that had lost confidence in their beams, still had to drop their bombs somewhere. They could see fires below, They could see the orange glow of a burning city, and the glow of a burning city, once started, became its own navigation beacon, drawing subsequent waves of aircraft like moths to a lamp. Each bomb that fell on London made London more visible to the next wave. Each fire that burned in Bristol lit the way for the crews still approaching from the Channel. The destruction was self-perpetuating, self-amplifying. What Britain needed was not merely a way to mislead bombers about where they were, but a way to give them somewhere convincing to go instead. The man most directly responsible for the creation of the Starfish sites was Colonel John Turner, head of the Air Ministry's Works Directorate, a precise, methodical civil servant who approached the problem of deceiving the Luftwaffe with the same systematic rigor he might have brought to procuring building materials for an airfield. Turner's team was officially known as Colonel Turner's Department, a designation so deliberately unmemorable as to be almost comical. They operated from Shepperton Studios in Middlesex, requisitioned for the war, their experimental fires burning on the studio backlots, alongside the props and painted flats of a pre-war film industry that had temporarily ceased to function. The challenge Turner's team faced was considerable. A burning city from 30,000 feet does not look like a single point of light. It looks like a spreading, irregular, pulsing mass of illumination. Different colors, different intensities, fires dying and rekindling as structures collapse and fuel is consumed. A single bonfire, however large, would fool nobody. What was required was a system of fires that mimicked the specific visual signature of a city struck by incendiaries. The initial small fires as buildings caught, the rapid spread as streets ignited, the intense white-yellow burn of industrial fires against the deeper orange of burning timber. Turner's engineers studied aerial reconnaissance photographs of bombed cities with extraordinary care, noting the precise visual patterns that distinguished a railway yard fire from a domestic conflagration, the particular bloom of a gasworks igniting, the long thin lines of burning terraced streets. What they eventually developed was a series of fire types, each designed for a specific visual purpose. The first and most basic were long steel baskets, each roughly 2 meters in length and 60 centimeters wide, filled with a mixture of creosote-soaked wood and old engine oil. These were the background fires, the equivalent of the general conflagration of a burning district. Laid out in grids across open fields, with each basket separated from its neighbors by roughly 90 meters, they created from altitude the impression of a large area burning broadly and consistently. Igniting one of these baskets produced a flame visible from 15 miles on a clear night. A grid of 40 or 50 baskets, staggered and lit in sequence, produced the visual impression of something very much larger. The second fire type was more specialized. To simulate the intense, short-duration flash of an incendiary bomb striking and igniting, Turner's team developed what they called boiler fires, sealed drums of oil with controlled vents that, when punctured by a small explosive charge, sent a column of flame 15 to 20 meters into the sky before subsiding to a lower burn. A single boiler fire, detonated remotely from a sandbagged control post half a kilometer away, produced a flash visible from 30,000 feet. A sequence of boiler fires, detonated at intervals of 30 to 90 seconds, created the impression of a stick of incendiary bombs walking across a built-up area, each one finding fresh fuel. There was also a third element, perhaps the most ingenious of all, the water fire. Turner's engineers had noticed that fires burning near rivers and canals produced a distinctive double image in aerial photographs, the real fire and its reflection combining to create an elongated, wavering bloom of light. Many of Britain's most important industrial cities, Sheffield, Birmingham, Coventry, were built on rivers. A decoy site without this reflective signature might be dismissed as unconvincing. Turner's team therefore incorporated shallow pools, dug by hand and lined with clay, at the edges of their fire arrays, positioned so that the glow of the background fires would be reflected upward into the night sky. The sites themselves were constructed with remarkable speed. A typical starfish site. The name is variously attributed to the phrase special fire, abbreviated to SF and then elaborated, though the precise etymology remains somewhat contested. Covered between 400 and 600 acres of open countryside. Each site was connected to the national telephone network by a direct line running back to a regional fire control center, from which the fires could be ordered, lit the moment a raid was detected, heading for the target city the site was designed to protect. The sites were always positioned to the south and east of their target cities, accounting for the predominant direction of German approach. A site protecting Bristol, for instance, would be positioned on the flat farmlands of the Somerset levels or the open downs to the south, close enough to the city that deflected aircraft would waste their bombs before reaching the suburbs, but far enough away that the fires would not themselves guide aircraft toward the real target. The construction materials were deliberately common. The steel baskets could be fabricated by any competent blacksmith. The drums were standard industrial containers. The ignition systems used modified agricultural equipment. This was not accidental. Turner understood that the program would need to be expanded rapidly if it was to work, and that expansion required components that could be sourced, fabricated, and installed without drawing on the specialist manufacturing capacity that the rest of the war effort desperately needed. The total cost of equipping a standard Starfish site has been estimated at between £5,000 and £8,000, a fraction of the cost of a single night's bombing raid. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. It means the channel can keep telling stories like this one. The operational history of the Starfish network is by its nature difficult to document with precision. The sites were secret. The Air Ministry did not publicize their existence. German intelligence, to the extent that it became aware of them, was not in a position to publish corrections. And the records that survive are often fragmentary, classified for decades after the war, and subject to the additional uncertainty that haunts all deception operations. You cannot always prove that a bomber that dropped its load on empty fields would otherwise have hit a city, because you cannot know what the crew would have done without the decoy. What can be established is this. Between November 1940 and May 1941, the height of the Blitz, Starfish sites are credited by Air Ministry post-war analysis with diverting at least 730 bombing sorties from their intended targets. The largest single recorded success came on the night of the 2nd of December, 1940, when a major raid apparently targeting Bristol saw a significant proportion of its bomb loads fall on the Starfish sites at Chewstoke and Blagden, to the south of the city. Local accounts describe the fields burning for hours. The craters from bombs that fell alongside the fire arrays were still visible years after the war ended. The alternative, that those bombs had fallen on Bristol's central districts, already strained by weeks of raids, is not something that can be quantified, only imagined. There are accounts from local fire-watching teams stationed near Starfish sites, their task being to report on the success of individual activations that convey something of the strange, terrible drama of watching a fake city burn. One Home Guard report from a site in Wiltshire describes the night sky turned red, the distant sound of aero engines, then the shriek and crump of falling bombs detonating across the fields a mile away, the earth shaking faintly underfoot, the fires roaring back to renewed intensity as incendiaries added their heat to the controlled baskets. The watcher finishes his account with a single terse line: "No casualties. Site operational." In the language of bureaucratic understatement, it is almost moving. The psychological effect on Luftwaffe crews is harder to assess, though there is suggestive evidence. Several German aircrew captured during this period and subsequently interrogated by British intelligence described confusion about targets during night raids, uncertainty about whether fires visible below represented already struck targets or new opportunities. The existence of decoy fires was not apparently something that German aircrew were widely briefed about, though Luftwaffe intelligence must have suspected their existence. A 1941 German signals intelligence document, captured later in the war, refers to British Ablenkungsfeuer, diversionary fires, as a known countermeasure, suggesting that by mid-1941 the Luftwaffe was at least aware of the phenomenon, even if they could not consistently distinguish decoy from genuine target. The German approach to the same problem was, characteristically, both more elaborate and less effective. The Luftwaffe operated its own decoy site program, known as Scheinwerfer Täuschung, or deceptive illumination, and later developed more sophisticated dummy target systems around major industrial areas in the Reich as Allied bombing intensified. These sites attempted to replicate the visual signature of burning cities and industrial facilities with varying success. American 8th Air Force and RAF Bomber Command aircrew reports from 1943 and 1944 contain occasional references to spurious fires and dummy targets, and post-war bomb damage assessment concluded that a small but meaningful fraction of Allied bomb tonnage had fallen on decoy sites rather than true targets. However, the German program benefited from none of the systematic scientific analysis that characterized Turner's work, and accounts suggest that many German decoy sites were too small, too regular in their fire spacing, or too isolated from genuine infrastructure to convince experienced crews. The Americans, for their part, developed their own interest in deception fires as the Pacific War expanded, studying the British experience through liaison channels. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers produced a technical assessment of Starfish site construction in 1943, and elements of the British approach appear to have influenced American thinking about target protection in both theaters. The precise extent of this cross-pollination remains difficult to establish from available records. What then is the actual legacy of the Starfish sites? In strictly material terms, the program must be counted a significant success. The sites undoubtedly diverted bomb loads from city centers during the most intense phase of the Blitz. They did so at negligible cost in materials and at no cost in human life. A counter-weapon that killed nobody, that destroyed nothing of value, that worked precisely because it was more efficient to give the enemy something to hit than to stop him hitting at all. In that respect, it represents a kind of strategic thinking that was genuinely unusual for its period. Not more guns, not more fighters, but a deeper understanding of what the enemy was trying to do, and a systematic exploitation of the gap between what he intended and what he achieved. The psychological dimension is harder to quantify, but should not be dismissed. A bomber crew that drops its load on open countryside and then navigates home without loss has still completed its mission in the most literal sense. It has flown to England and dropped bombs, but it has not achieved anything of military value. And in the grinding arithmetic of a bombing campaign sustained over months, the cumulative effect of misdirected sorties matters. Fuel consumed, bombs expended, hours of crew time spent. Each of these is a cost. Each decoy success is a small subtraction from the total weight of effort the Luftwaffe could bring to bear. Today, the physical traces of the Starfish program are largely invisible. The steel baskets were recovered after the war and sold for scrap. The craters have grassed over. The shallow pools have been drained or absorbed back into the landscape. In a handful of locations across southern England, aerial photography reveals faint patterns in fields that mark where baskets once stood in their careful grids. But these are easily overlooked and not generally marked. The files that document the program in the National Archives at Kew run to several thick folders, dry with bureaucratic language, full of the names of men who spent the worst years of the 20th century building fake cities in dark fields and watching the sky. Return then to that December night in 1940. The fires burn, the bombers turn, the bombs fall on empty Somerset. And somewhere in Bristol, in a terrace house near the docks or a factory shed near Temple Meads, a family sleeps on undisturbed, or a night shift worker walks home through the blackout, not knowing what did not happen to him. That is the measure of Turner's achievement and of the men and women who built and operated his sites. Not the fires they lit, but the ones they prevented. Not the destruction they caused, but the destruction they quietly, ingeniously, invisibly refused to allow. The Starfish sites were a weapon that looked like nothing. That was precisely the point.